My name is Eric Zilo. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the chair of the Department of History and Philosophy, and I am the, leader, the right word, of the Connections Lecture Series committee. Leadership is probably a bit of a stretch. We show up periodically and decide about cool people we want to hear. So, take it for what it is. The Connections series, we have one event in the fall, one event in the spring each year, generally in a couple of parts. So I'll say something about that. The purpose of the series is really to showcase that knowledge doesn't stop conveniently at disciplinary borders, at department doorways, or at national borders. And in this case, we're going to be talking about travel. And certainly travel is a way that connections are made on a routine basis and can be pretty compelling and pretty interesting and pretty important. We're going to talk about tonight's event. We are having a panel discussion at 5 o'clock in this room. It will be our speaker, who I'll introduce in just a moment, joined by a number of esteemed faculty members of this institution, whose expertise ranges from environmental science to history to mathematics. The mathematics of travel, think about that for just a moment. We'll be talking about biology and travel, and a host of other things as well. It should be a whole lot of fun. So that's from 5 to 6:30 in this room. I hope that you will come by. There'll be a lot of opportunity for you to ask questions of people and try and, I like to say, stump the chump. So you can ask us questions and try and see if we get flummoxed. Should be good fun. Our speaker today is kind of a big deal. He's an international celebrity, well known in Brazil as one of the leading YouTube celebrities there. In the United States, he worked as the Frugal Traveler, a very popular column for the New York Times, which, and this is no fake news, is the single most important newspaper in the United States. He currently has a new book out. I've read this book. I've read it in draft form. It is fantastic. Rediscovering Travel, a guide for the globally curious. It is part travel memoir. It is part advice about how to go about traveling and still having a little bit of money left over whilst having amazing experiences. And there's even some history in there, which is kind of nifty as well. I'm a little biased on that front, but it's pretty cool. Please join me in welcoming our speaker, Seth Kugel. One last thing, I should say, you have copies of this available. It is not going to, as they say in the music business, drop for 2 more weeks. We have advanced copies. You can buy them over.
This is the only place in the world where this book is available on sale.
They haven't even given him any more than this copy. So there you go.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm happy to be introduced as kind of a big deal. Is that what you said?
No, that means you're a big deal.
Well, kind of is what I was focused on. I think that's probably closer to the truth. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to the people who came to see me. Thank you to the people who came for the lunch. I hope I'm as good as the brownies. They are delicious. So I was asked to talk about connections with travel. And the way I'm going to do that is tell you about my travel philosophy that I've kind of developed. I'll just give you a little background. I always traveled as a kid. I was really lucky. My parents took us on about 4 or 5 big trips when I was a kid. And then when I got to, I went to a YMCA camp in Massachusetts, and I got to go on a camper exchange trip to Western Kenya and stay in a really old-fashioned, African village in the era before cell phones. Now I've found the village on Google satellite maps. It's there, and the huts aren't round anymore, and so it doesn't really exist the way I remember it. Got to do that. I became a teacher with the Teach for America program and got to visit my students in the Dominican Republic. So what would happen is I'd go to a party at my student's birthday party. I had 3rd graders, and the parents would say, hey, why don't you come with us to the Dominican Republic this summer? This is in the South Bronx. And I really do not think they ever imagined I would say yes. But I did, and I went, and I spent a month with them. And these two experiences, the Kenya trip and the Dominican Republic trip, totally ruined me for regular travel. It was all about, it was me with a family living in a place. And so since then, in my own travels, I have tried to recreate that a little bit. I've sort of shied away from going on group tours, although those have their place and time. And I've just tried to get out and meet people and have really fun experiences. I did that on my own a bunch, and then at one point the travel editor of the New York Times said to me, Seth, where have you been recently? Just a guy I knew because he had just become the travel editor. I've never written a travel story in my life. He said, where have you been recently? And it just happened to be I was learning Portuguese at the time, and I had just taken a boat from the Colombian border to the Amazonian city of Manaus in order to be isolated with Portuguese speakers. And for 4 days, I just spoke Portuguese all day and learned more than I had in a year of class. And that became my first travel story. And so from then on, I had this amazing job where I got to travel and write about it. And it's really, I was talking about this yesterday. One of the keys to, and I'll get into this, of being a really good traveler is to not have any fear of talking to people, to strangers, even though they might be completely different than you. And I am generally terrified of doing that. But as a columnist for the New York Times, I found I was forced to do that, because otherwise my column is going to be really boring. So let's get into it. I didn't even plan that part. Let's talk about why people travel. Actually, let me just ask you, what are some of the reasons people who have had the privilege of traveling, why do you do it? Anybody? Shout it out. Participation?
Because it's cold in Maine.
Well, have you been influenced by this first slide? Yeah, so absolutely, to get away from something. It could be the weather, could be your children, I don't know. Could be a lot of things. Your ex-boyfriend, there's a lot of reasons. What else? Anything else? Yes?
To see other places.
Right. Yeah, to see the world, right? That's a good one. Anybody who's a student have a contribution? Yeah.
For educational reasons?
Sorry?
For educational reasons?
Like what? Like to study at a university?
Yeah, I just won a semester abroad.
Yeah, fantastic. Right, okay. And
to exploring other cultures, as you said.
right, okay, so great. So there's a lot of ways to travel. To me, I sort of categorize it like this. The old relaxation reason, where you go and your whole purpose is just to disconnect and forget about either your own problems or the weather in Maine or whatever. And actually, I tend to think that this is not the kind of travel it's not really what I mean by travel in a way. I kind of call this remote relaxation, which is great, and I love it, but it's not really what we're talking about today. I'm kind of excluding this from the talk today. There's another kind of travel where you are going just to see famous things. I've decided to put up the Empire State Building, the Statue of Liberty, and the Met in New York because I do this YouTube channel telling Brazilians what to do and how to act in New York. If you want to check it out, it has subtitles in English. It's called Amigo Gringo. You have to activate the YouTube subtitles. I am the Amigo Gringo. Which weirdly, in Spanish, we'll talk to our scholar here, but in Spanish, gringo has kind of a negative connotation. In Portuguese, in Brazil, it just means foreigner. It pretty much any foreigner. So if you're from Argentina and you go to Brazil, you're a gringo. Interesting, right? Impressing even the Latin American scholar over here. So I tell them, New York is not just about going to the Empire State Building, the Statue. What happens to a lot of Brazilians, who are just the tourists I know the best, they come to New York, they have a week, they rush around trying to check off boxes. Oh my God, I can't go to New York without going to the top of the Empire State Building, going to the Statue of Liberty, which by the way takes a whole day, and going to the Met, which could easily take a whole day. And I try to tell them, okay, of course you want to do those things, but that's not all there is to travel. And by the way, like checking off boxes and feeling that you should see something in order to be a worldly person has existed ever since the Grand Tour. Any historical corrections on travel, please speak up, Eric. Eric was, by the way, a big part of this book for me. I'm just going to take a slight pause and say this. I was writing the book and I wanted to include a chapter about the history of travel. And I was floundering. And what year did your book come out?
2016.
In 2016, I was floundering and I was just Googling around and it appeared magically before me on Amazon. History of Modern Tourism, is that the name of it? And anyway, just a side note to say that the University of New England participated in the production of this book. In any case, the Grand Tour, people have been traveling around to sort of check off boxes for a long time. The Grand Tour was sort of 17th century, late 17th century?
Starts in 17th century.
Yeah.
18th century.
18th century, so 1600s, 1700s, sort of the richer folks in Britain, young men, would go on this grand tour of Europe where they would hit all the sort of cultural hotspots. They were young men, so they didn't only go to the cultural hotspots, but it was sort of believed that this was what cultured people did. They went to Rome, they went to Florence, they went to Paris, they met the right people, they sort of became cultured. And so we've been doing this sort of thing, like I have to go to the Empire State Building, I have to go to Rome, I have to go to Paris. We've been doing that for a long time. So there's this long history of travel kind of telling us what we should do when we travel. And I sort of tried to get away from that. There have been also travelers in the past who have shied away from it as well. And this is a traveler that I greatly admire, Mary Kingsley. She makes a number of appearances in my book. She was a British woman who traveled twice for, I think, several months each to Africa towards the end of the 19th century. So this was very unusual. First of all, it was unusual she wasn't the only woman to travel alone, but certainly there were not so many of them. And she went to West Africa, which at the time was largely, it was colonial. So the only people that really were there from England were, I think, colonial officials and missionaries and that sort of thing. Anyway, I think of Mary Kingsley as the first person to criticize TripAdvisor. Because how did she do it? When she wanted to go on this trip, she sort of sought advice from other people who had been there before. And they came back with all kinds of terrifying advice, like you can't go there, you can't go here, you're going to die, et cetera, et cetera. And then she went, and I'm just going to read this quote. So when she got all this advice, she wrote, "I think many seem to translate my request for practical hints and advice into an advertisement that said, 'Rubbish may be shot here.'" Then when she went, she found that this advice that she had gotten had no relation to the real world. One by one, I took my old ideas derived from books and thoughts based on imperfect knowledge and weighed them against the real life around me and found them either worthless or wanting. So she basically struck out on her own. She sort of went all over the place. She made friends and adventured into villages and sort of just found her own way, came back with a different vision of Africa and of colonialism, and actually spent a number of years giving lectures that included a lot of barbed critiques of colonialism. So she went and tried to figure out what was actually happening there as opposed to what her friends were telling her. And today I compare that always to TripAdvisor because that's where we get all our information from people who have been places before. So I want to tell you about one trip that I took. It's cut off a little bit, but this is the map of US 17. That's a road that goes approximately from Virginia to Savannah, Georgia, at least. Anyway, that's the route that I took. And this trip for me really crystallized, my belief in how to travel. The thing is, I always think when I'm going on a trip, like, okay, I'm going to be really adventurous. I'm not going to do what TripAdvisor says. I'm going to talk to people, and then some of the time I chicken out completely. I'm usually writing a story for the New York Times, and I have this fear that like nothing's going to happen. It's going to be a boring story, and even worse, I haven't gone to the number 1, number 2, number 3 places that are very well thought of. So then I chicken out. But this trip really worked out pretty well. I actually went with my current ex-girlfriend. That is why she is. Yeah. We'll actually get into why she broke up with me a little bit later. It is travel related. But it is also sort of hard to date a travel writer for a travel columnist. I no longer do the column, but because I was just never around. But that's not the reason she broke up. You'll find it. Okay, so we went on a road trip. We went on a road trip down US 17, and by the way, that's not the fastest way to get from Virginia to Savannah, Georgia. You can take the interstate, I think it's I-95, and you can do it very, very quickly. My idea was we're going to take this road, we're just going to map out the first night where we're going to stay, we're going to do couch surfing, actually we did, the first night, and after that we're just going to see what happens. I printed out I printed out this massive map because I don't like using the phone to see big areas, and we just sort of made some notes about cool things that might be along the way, and then we just went. So I want to tell you about one day when we were in South Carolina. We were driving along. Oh, this is getting a little ahead of the story, but we were driving along, and we stopped off for a very late breakfast, muffins and all that kind of stuff at some diner. And then maybe an hour later, we were sort of driving down US 17 and we passed Hog Heaven Barbecue. And I had just eaten an hour before, but you just can't possibly not stop when there's 3 pigs with halos around their head. And then it's sort of confusing, right? Because are they going to eat themselves? Are they cannibals? I don't know, but I thought it was creative, and I said, we've got to stop. She thought it was crazy because we had just eaten. She basically didn't eat much at all, but they had an all-you-can-eat barbecue buffet for like $5.95. And that's just incredible. They also had this thing called Oreo Delight for dessert, which was very good. I'm a big Oreo fan. Okay, so then we set up out on the road again, and we were driving a little bit further, and we found this place. It's an old country store, the Carolina Country Store. And it said, I don't think the sign is there, but there's a sign right behind this that said, boiled peanuts. Has anybody ever had boiled peanuts, like Southern-style boiled peanuts? Okay, what did you think of them?
I love them.
Oh, they're terrible.
No, you said bald peanut.
Oh, a ball peanut? Got it. They have, to me, I respect your incorrect opinion, but they have it's literally, when I first tasted them, which was not on this trip, I said, this is why God invented honey roasting. They're mushy and disgusting. I suppose, every food, if you grow up with the food, you like it even though it's terrible. So the Southerners will have to forgive me. We're about as far from the South, I think, as you can get, luckily. There it says double boiled peanuts. Sorry, I didn't even see that. So we stopped. So I said to my girlfriend, I said, oh my God, we've got to stop for boiled peanuts. And she said, you are completely insane. We just ate basically 2 lunches. I'm like, no, how can you not stop at this place? And if we're going to stop here, we need an excuse to stop. And so we're going to go get some boiled peanuts. And she's like, ugh, all right. Still willing to date me, but getting to be less and less willing. Then we go in the door and we see the sign, baby chicks and ducks for sale. So I'm already loving it. Let me see what the next picture is. I looked at the preview. Oh yeah, so we go inside, and inside there's all this old stuff all around. It's practically like a museum of stuff. And the really quirky owner, and he has outside, they do sell chicks and ducks, but they also have a little western city built for chickens. So there's a church. That rooster was on the church, but there was also a bunch of chickens in the brothel, You know, they had all kinds of different places. So this was, I mean, we would not have seen this if we hadn't stopped for boiled peanuts. And this was really one of the most extraordinary. I wish I had more pictures of it. Oh, look, there's even a his and hers outhouses. Is that what that is? I didn't even notice that. Anyway, what a crazy place. And we had a great conversation with this guy, and then I'm doing some, I don't know what I was there. I think I was talking to the owner, and I noticed my girlfriend was talking to this guy. And I'm like, okay, let's see what they're talking about. I went over. This guy is teaching her how to trap an alligator with her bare hands. There was no alligator actually there, so it was a theoretical class. And I was just like, okay, this is amazing. Now you're going to teach me. And I said, where do you learn how to do that? And he said, no, I work on a plantation, an old plantation, and this is what I have to do for my job. Sometimes I have to trap the alligators. And he said, you want a tour? And I said, wait, you work on the plantation, you don't own the plantation. He's like, yeah, my boss doesn't care. I'll just take you guys around. Now, he doesn't know that I'm a writer working for the New York Times. And I never tell anyone I am until later. So I'm like, all right, let's just go. And he took us there. This is the entry to the plantation. We're getting into real, like, stereotypical southern plantation here. And it was an old plantation and with slaves. And the first place he took us was, oh, there we are again. Okay, that's at the entrance. There he is. Oh yeah, so the first place he showed us were slave quarters. These were the old slave quarters. And of course, he's a Gullah, which is a sort of an ethnic, I don't know exactly, you know the Gullah, you know, they're like a descendant of, I'm not even going to say what it is because I'm going to get it wrong, but they're a group of African Americans who are descended directly from slaves and who speak with a very interesting accent. They have a whole dialect. Anyway, so he knows a lot about the history of the place. His family has been in South Carolina for generations, and he took us up there, and he's like, hey, you want to go in the slave quarters? I'm like, what? These are real slave quarters? Are you kidding me? This is a private land, et cetera, et cetera. Takes us over. He opens the door and he peeks in and he says, is anybody there? And I'm like, what are you looking for? Snakes? And he says, no, I'm looking for ghosts. And we go in, and that's it. We see the slave quarters. It's just absolutely incredible. Then he takes us out. That's the old rice mill, not in use anymore. From like I guess in the 19th century they used it. Takes us inside the rice mill. You know, like is the owner going to come by and fire him and shoot me or whatever? He also shows us, I'm not sure if you can tell, he's killed a wild boar. There's a wild boar on the ground there. Anyway, this guy gave the tour of a lifetime. This is the little museum they have on the plantation, private museum, of all the artifacts they find. So these are buttons from slave uniforms, sconces, tip of a cane. They just come across this stuff. Some of them go around with metal detectors and look for stuff around the plantation. And that's the view. And then he said something, pretty interesting at the end. He said, you want to go in the owner's house? I'm like, okay, now this is getting a little bit much. He took us in, and it turned out that this was a plantation owned by Ted Turner. You know Ted Turner, he founded CNN, the Turner Broadcasting, TBS, all that kind of stuff. So we had just gotten a huge tour of Ted Turner's, what he now uses as a duck hunting plantation. And so, anyway, it all started because I decided to have some boiled peanuts. So that's sort of the idea of my ideal travel day. None of this stuff is in any guidebook, anything like that. The Carolina Country Store, I think now you can find it, but then it wasn't even on TripAdvisor yet. So, so let's just go over why I travel. I travel the same reason many people travel, to break routine. That could be the weather, like I said, could be the weather, could be you go to the same school or the same job or whatever every day. Okay, so I think a lot of people travel for that reason. To strengthen relationships. So if you travel with people, if you have kids or you travel with your grandmother or whatever it is, that's a great bonding experience. Yeah, I didn't really strengthen that relationship. I forgot I put another slide. Oh, right. Okay, so this is the part where I tell you about why she broke up with me. It was on this trip. She got a little sick of my travel shenanigans. At the end of the trip, we went to Savannah, Georgia, and I sort of promised her after all this stuff that we'd go out to a nice dinner the final day, because I'm taking her to all these cheapo places. And then on the last day, we were in this art gallery, and I sort of said to someone, where can we get some good barbecue in Savannah? And the guy said, okay, this is what you gotta do. You gotta walk out of town, like a mile this way, and then to this outside of the historic center of Savannah, which is this gorgeous old southern town. And you'll end up at this place, Randy's Barbecue, which is like, again, like a mile out of the city center. So she's like, where's my romantic dinner? I'm like, no, come on, let's go. We're going to the barbecue place. We go to the barbecue place, I order some barbecue, and she's like, where are we gonna sit and eat this? So I'm like, oh yeah, there's nowhere to sit. So I asked the guy in the barbecue place, he said, yeah, it's easy, you just sit at the bus stop. Yeah. So, I'm not going to say that we broke up that day, but that day did start a big fight, and we broke up shortly thereafter because I made her go and eat barbecue ribs sitting in the bus stop. Anyway, that's one of the reasons why I traveled to strengthen relationships. It didn't work out in that case. To have a lot of great stories to tell, I think a lot of people travel to come back and tell their friends about it. You might deny that, but what if I told you when you go on your next trip, you weren't allowed to tell anybody about it when you got back? That would completely change. You'd be like, what are you? Okay, you wouldn't do it. You wouldn't do it. So we do a lot of stuff. We do like to tell stories about our travels, and people like to hear stories, or at least I hope people like to hear stories of our travels, or you guys are in the wrong place. Okay, and finally, to understand, well, not finally, to understand the world a bit. Someone mentioned that, to get to know the world, to see it's a big world out there. We all live in a very, very slender sliver of the world. And this got cut off, which is unfortunate because it is the name of the lecture, to make connections. I promise it does say to make connections. And I think that for me, there's a whole section, I didn't just make this up because it's the name of the series. There's a whole section in the book called Making Connections, and that's when I sort of talk about, we'll get to that later. It's where I sort of talk about how people think often that they're traveling to get away, to isolate themselves from their life back home, but it's actually completely impossible to just completely get away and detach. As this great writer, Alain de Botton, whatever, he's like a philosopher, I think, right? Philosopher, Alain de Botton, anyone know? Okay. He wrote a book called The Art of Travel, and there's one passage in it which is just great. He goes to Barbados, and he's just had a really stressful time at work, and I don't know, he's arguing with his boss. He goes on a trip to Barbados, and he gets there, and he gets up really early the first morning. He got in at night, and he goes out on this sort of paradise of a beach, and he sits on something quite like the picture I showed you before. And he realizes he's totally stressed out because he forgot to tell someone at work to do something, and now he's all in a panic about how he's going to do it. And this was a long time ago, and there was not an easy way to get in touch. And he says, his quote is, he says, I realized I'd made a big mistake. I had brought myself with me on vacation. And it's just really hard to completely detach, and I don't even think we should. When I'm traveling, I'm always trying to, it's amazing how much you can learn about I was just speaking to a class this morning. It's amazing how much you can learn about where you're from by going on vacation somewhere else and seeing how people react to you. This is especially true for Americans, especially true in the era of Trump, but it was also true in the era of Obama. Everywhere I went during both presidencies, people are just really interested in talking to Americans, which is not true of every country. So it's a great way to make connections. I'm going to tell a story of a couple more unusual connections. And this also involves an ex-girlfriend, whose face I've also, this is from a long time ago, it's about 12 years ago. So I'm going to tell you a little story about her. She is Brazilian, And when I was dating her, I don't know if our Latin American expert knows about Brazilians' hygiene routines. But I had no idea at the time. I thought it was Brazilians are extremely hygienic. They take more showers per week than any other country in the world, according to a study published in The Economist. And I mean like many more showers. Okay, so she also had a rule, like you couldn't be anywhere near she couldn't sleep over, you couldn't do anything like that without taking a shower first. I take showers in the morning. I don't know about you guys. You take a shower in the morning because you want to be fresh for the day, and you go out. But no, if you're a Brazilian, most Brazilians, where does that Steve? Does your wife take a lot of showers?
Yes. Can I also say spending lots of time in the bathroom?
Yeah.
It's lots of trimming and perfume.
So yes, and so something else is true about this woman, who I'm not going to say her name, but that's just whatever. You wouldn't know her. She also had a strange, what would you call it? Stereotype, or she did not like Chinese people. She thought they were incredibly dirty. That was her thing. I invited her to go to Chinatown to dinner. She's like, I'm not going to go. Too dirty. Not sanitary. And of course, I, being a good New Yorker, I'm like, that is so offensive. And I just was like, my girlfriend is a jerk. She's a racist. And so this is all leading up to 2 trips I made to Brazil and to China, where I found out, and I was able to connect the knowledge I made on vacation to understanding my ex-girlfriend. So I took 2 boat trips. I told you already about the boat in the Amazon, so let's go back to that. The boats in the Amazon look kind of like this. The Amazon doesn't have highways, really, so to get from one place to another, I always call these the Greyhound buses of the Amazon. You basically go on these boats, and if you saw Motorcycle Diaries, Che Guevara goes on a very similar boat. It looks exactly the same still today. And you sleep in hammocks for a couple of days, and then you get to where you're going. And so I got on this boat, and there's a bunch of bathrooms on the boat, and you can probably imagine what the bathrooms are like. They're not modern bathrooms by any means. There's no lights in them, and it's really dark in there, and I kind of found them sort of disgusting. And I realized this boat is going to smell terrible within a couple of days. But the amazing thing is, it didn't. The Brazilians didn't care how disgusting the bathroom was. They were in there taking showers day and night in the middle of the Amazon, and the whole boat smelled like a body lotion or something like that. I mean, perfume and body lotion. I've never been in a cleaner place. And you know what? There was a couple other gringos on the boat, and they refused to use the bathroom, and they stank. And the Brazilians were incredibly hygienic. Okay, let's fast forward to a trip I made to China, where I also took a ferry boat. And this is kind of the typical scene on the boat. These guys are sitting there and they're chewing sunflower seeds, and I don't know if you can be able to see this, but then they spit them out on the ground, basically. So the whole boat is covered in sunflower seed shells. And I'm like, I don't care, it's fine with me. I thought that was actually quite interesting. And then I went to my cabin. Let's see if I got that photo right. Okay, so I was sharing a cabin with a Chinese family, and this was the Chinese family. And it was really one of the most fantastic travel experiences I've ever had, is trying to communicate with these people who are sleeping in the same room I am. But when I got to the room, I had another hygiene-related experience. This is what the room looked like. So it was 4 beds, and this was my bed down here. But when I originally, I guess I have a pointer. Oh yeah, awesome. That was my bed down here. And when I got in the room, it was about 3 in the morning when it stopped at my stop. And they said, okay, you're in this room. And I walk in, and there's 2 kids sleeping here. There's a kid sleeping here. There's a grandmother sleeping up here. There's a mother sleeping here. Basically, there's no bed for me whatsoever. So I go back and I tell the staff on the boat, which can't even understand what I'm saying, but I'm using Google Translate. I said, full, my room is full. And she's like, no, it isn't. Come on, let's go. She comes in, we go into the room, she opens the door, she starts screaming at them. It sounded like screaming to me, but I don't know. It's hard to judge when you don't know the actual words someone is saying. And the two kids scrambled out of this bunk, went elsewhere, and left the bunk for me. And I'm like, are you going to change the sheets? No. Well, I couldn't even say that anyway because I didn't speak Chinese. But so there I go. I went into the bed, and here I am thinking about my ex-girlfriend who wouldn't even let me get anywhere near her bed without taking a shower, and now I go to sleep in a bed that has just been slept in for God knows how many days actually by these two kids. And so that's the sort of thing I mean when I'm talking about traveling and really learning something about the world. What's the next slide? That's what I love when this kind of stuff happens. Now, do I think that the Chinese are disgusting and that the Brazilians are angelic with their hygiene? No, not at all. I had no problem with sunflower seeds split on the ground, but I sure did understand why my incredibly hygienic Brazilian thought the way she thought about going to Chinatown. She had this stereotype in her mind, and she couldn't believe people would do stuff like that. But as I always tell Brazilians, I'm like, we don't take that many showers. And also Brazilians have another thing. They don't touch their food. Does it have, they will
Napkins.
they use napkins. You go to anywhere with a Brazilian, if there's some sort of finger food, they always take a napkin and they touch the food. I'm like, why aren't you touching your food? Well, and they're like, no, it's unhealthy, you'll get sick. Like the entire United States of America does not use napkins and touches their food. And there is no epidemic of sickness in the United States. It's just simply, it can't possibly be true. Maybe there's a biologist here that will contradict me. And also, I don't see in China everyone dying of cooties from sleeping in other people's beds. So, you learn things about the world when you're traveling, if you travel this way, that I think are just so invaluable. By the way, most tourists when they go down, this is on the Yangtze River, most tourists when they go, they take a cruise ship, with other tourists. And believe me, it's easier. Believe me, none of them spoke any English whatsoever. You know how we passed the time, I had a Mandarin phrase book? I would just read to them, and they thought it was hilarious. It was I would count to 10, and it was awesome. And then I would try to say stuff like, I'm American, and they'd think I said, I am a horse, because of all the tones. Anyway, I'm definitely falling behind in this. So the other thing about China, again, so these connections, often the connections come in the form of learning something that you didn't know, right? So when you buy stuff on the street in China, of course, food is, I've never had a better time eating than I had traveling around China, because it's finally real Chinese food in such incredible varieties, usually incredibly delicious, usually fresh made, but you have to know how much things cost. And so you could, I suppose, write down numbers or something, or you could use your hands to say how much stuff costs. Okay, 10, right? Not right. This is how the Chinese count to 5 on one hand. Makes sense? Everyone follow it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Anyone know how to count to 10 on your hands in Chinese? Well, for some reason, maybe they don't want to. Maybe it's too cold. They don't want to take off 2 mittens. They do it all on one hand. This is 6 through 10. So I go and I'm like, okay, how much is this? Oh, it's this much. Oh, it's this much. No idea. And the guy must have looked at me like I was a complete idiot. How could you not know that this is 6? This is like something to do at a rock concert or something. Right? In any case, and so you begin to realize just how little you know about the world. And then when other visitors, I live in New York City, there's tons of tourists there. Now when they do totally culturally inappropriate things, they have an incredibly greater tolerance for that. Let me just, how are we doing for time here? Are we running out of time? Let's go on another, can I get another 10, 15 minutes here? Does that sound good?
Oh, I was supposed to be done, 1:30.
Oh, until 1:30? Okay, we'll do 1:30.
1:50, 1:50, yes, you got time.
Oh, I got time. All right, great. Boy, these slides, I didn't really do a good job of them. So there is another reason people travel, and it's sort of related to telling stories, and it's to show off. And this is a part of travel I think we could sort of do without, and I think it drives people to make fewer connections, to have a less good time, because they're sort of concerned about what other people think about them. And I am sort of talking about social media. We do post a lot on social media when we're on vacation, but it's not just that. So in any case, this is sort of one of the things I'm talking about. I have a big problem with this. I do not need to see your feet, and I do not need to know you're at the beach. But this is a very, very popular thing to do on Instagram, right? And what is this even saying? Right? What is this saying? What are you trying to get across? Anyone care to guess? What are they trying to get across? Why do you do this? You're basically saying to them, I'm at the beach, you're not, you're a sucker. Please write and say, okay, well, this is in Spanish. Yeah, I want to be there. Yeah, take me with you. Well, I mean, if I were to really make a comment, I'd just be like, shut up already. Okay. By the way, these oh, this at least has a little mountain in the background. But this doesn't even tell you anything. All it says is, I'm on a beach, you're not, here are my feet. And look, 72 likes, 28 likes. Somebody's liking this stuff. Oh yeah. Here's another reason. I had mentioned before you go to check off a bunch of boxes. You know, the Mona Lisa, has anyone been to see the Mona Lisa? Yeah. So is this what the room, this is not what the room where the Mona Lisa looks like. This is a perfect example of how travel is not as it appears on Instagram. You go and say, here I am at the Mona Lisa. You might imagine the person afterwards walking up to the Mona Lisa and examining it, considering the beauty of Leonardo da Vinci's works. But actually what it really is that. That is the room where the Mona Lisa is, and you can kind of see how they took the photo, right? Like if that person took a picture of that person, it would look like they were alone, the Mona Lisa. So most people, I think the Louvre once did a study and found something like 80% of the people who went to the Louvre, their primary purpose was to see the Mona Lisa. Oh, and by the way, the whole thing about selfies and showing off where you've been does go all the way back to the Grand Tour. I may have you to thank for this little item. The people who went on the Grand Tour also took selfies and showed them to other people hoping to get likes. But of course, photography didn't even exist yet, so they would hire painters, portrait artists to make a portrait of them in front of some place to show they were there. And they weren't even, I don't even think in this case the person was even there, but this is Rome. And it's sort of the outskirts of Rome, and you can see Rome in the background. This is Francis Bassett, the first Baron of Dunstanville and Bassett. So I just imagine this guy coming home from his grand tour. Meanwhile, he's got like servants with him and trunks full of stuff. Gets home, he hangs this portrait up on the wall in his living room. He invites his friends over, and basically they give him likes, right? They give him like 18th century likes. It's the same exact thing. So I think that one way to travel better is to try to forget about what other people are going to think of your trip and sort of just do it for yourself. Yeah, those are the same photos. Let's talk a little bit about a few more traps that travelers fall into that sort of takes away from travel, I think. Well, actually, take that back. Let's go back to the Mona Lisa. The Mona Lisa, anyone know anything about the history of the Mona Lisa besides people who study the history of tourism? Anyone know what made the Mona Lisa famous? All right. So in 1907, this is a guidebook from 1907 Paris. That's a 470-page guidebook about Paris. If you went in there looking for something about the Mona Lisa, you're finding one sentence about the Mona Lisa. Okay? The Mona Lisa was a well-known painting, but it was just another well-known painting of the, I don't know, few dozen most famous paintings at the Louvre. But that was 1907, and that's a slide with nothing on it. Then if we go back to Mark Twain was, by the way, if you want to read anyone's travel writing, don't read mine. Well, read mine. It's available at the bookstore. But also read The Innocents Abroad, which is his tale of a trip around the world. And he is the most hilarious travel writer. And you will recognize, if Mark Twain were here, I think he would have given a very similar presentation, except he would probably be funnier. Anyway, he wrote this book in 1860-something, and he goes to the Louvre, and he doesn't even mention the Mona Lisa. So 1860s, 1907, no mention of the Mona Lisa. The Mona Lisa didn't really become really famous until 1911, I believe. Yeah, August of 1911, the Mona Lisa, which by the way was not even called the Mona Lisa officially, it's called La Gioconda, was stolen. And this was a worldwide sensation, right? It was, look, it's the front page of the New York Times, and it was missing for 2 years. And during this 2 years, it was like this amazing saga. And at the end of 2 years, they found it, and they caught the guy, and they returned the Mona Lisa to the Louvre. And this had captivated the world. And so 1911 to 1913, let's see, who was alive then? Our great-grandparents, great-great-grand, I don't know, whatever generation was alive then, everyone knew about the Mona Lisa. And thus the Mona Lisa became the most famous painting in the world. You guys all think of it as the most famous painting in the world. Google also, well, you can guess where to go. Well, anyway, you have to trust me. The Mona Lisa is under that thing, and my slide shows a little bit off. But Mona Lisa, if you type in most famous painting in the world, the Mona Lisa comes in first, okay? And why is that? So why do we even want to see the Mona Lisa? We don't even know why we're seeing the Mona Lisa. The reason we're seeing the Mona Lisa is because it was famous, and our great-grandparents were all caught up in how amazingly incredible this story was, and still, somehow today, we want to see the Mona Lisa. Okay. Okay, well, this is another little thing that Eric points out in his book, and is pretty well known, is how people started going to the beach. Beach is another thing. Like, personally, I think the beach is okay, but it's amazing to me that everybody wants to go to the beach and lie on the sand. And one of the reasons it's amazing to me is that's a relatively modern invention in the last few hundred years. Before, the sea was seen as like this mysterious place where your son or your husband or whatever went off in a ship and never came back. It was full of monsters. And nobody really went to the beach, and people started going, well, I'm going to run out of time, but people started going to the beach, and then eventually they started thinking, I'm going to get a tan at the beach. And one of my understanding of the way they got a tan is one time in the 1930s in Paris, 20s, 30s, counting on you, somewhere around there, Coco Chanel, the famous person whose perfume you may have used at some point, was a total fashion, like she was the fashion influencer, we'd call her today, in Paris in that time. And she once came back from a trip in which she got a sunburn. And the story goes, and it's really hard to find real documentation of this totally happening, is that she came back and everyone commented about her new fashion, which was to have darker skin from having been tanned. And that went along with, this was a famous American singer at the time in Paris who was African American. So dark skin got to be in fashion. You know, for many centuries, it was not at all in fashion to have dark skin. And obviously, we could talk about that forever, but you wanted to keep out of the sun so you could keep your skin as white as possible. But it turned, and now people started going to the beach trying to get a tan. Why? Because suddenly people started thinking tans look better. Okay, I guess sort of the final theme today is the difference between, or the contrast between, or the battle between planning and discovery. And one of the things I've sort of noticed with all the modern ways we travel, with our phones, with booking apps, with the maps, with Airbnb, TripAdvisor's behind there, is that we now can plan basically every second of every day of our travels. And a lot of us do. And I think it's important to realize that although that's good in a way that all this information is out there, it also locks us in to basically, being in lockstep with what every other tourist is doing, whatever the top. This is sort of true in a way with people who travel, like backpackers who travel with Lonely Planet like 10 or 15 years ago. Whatever was in Lonely Planet is where everyone would go. And I think that when people do that, they lose out on, what to me is the best part of travel, which is discovery. And how do I define discovery? I definitely don't define it as like Columbus discovering, quote unquote, America. To me, it's something very simple. It's in your regular life, you pretty much know everything's going to happen. You're going to come to school, you're going to go to class, you're going to go home, you're going to do your homework. Maybe something happens like they have turkey at the speech and you have a turkey sandwich and you weren't expecting it. Who knows? But when you're traveling, that's your chance to be surprised by things. So why do people use all these, especially TripAdvisor, to sort of know everything that's going to happen? So yeah, so here's Yelp. Here's Yelp's. Was anyone in the class this morning? I was talking about this. Yelp, if you look up restaurants on Yelp, this is my neighborhood, you're going to get, you know, the top restaurants from Yelp. Instead of walking around and finding a good restaurant. I realized that one of my favorite restaurants on Yelp in my neighborhood was ranked number 111th. Like nobody using Yelp would ever find my favorite restaurant in my neighborhood unless they scrolled all the way to number 111. And obviously they don't do that. And I want to contrast this with the way people used to travel before Lonely Planet, before TripAdvisor, before anything. There were always guidebooks. I showed you the Baedeker guidebook, 470 pages. But this is one of the most popular guidebooks. My mother used this when she traveled in the 1960s. It was by Arthur Frommer, who started the whole Frommer's Travel Guides. But it all started like this. He was a soldier. He was a GI in Europe. And he started making notes for his fellow soldiers about where to go for cheap to travel around Europe. And then he published it in a book. And I want you to note this. It's one of 2 maps of Paris in his section on Paris. And it's literally covering, you could have drawn this on a cocktail napkin. It's just got like a few little things near the Pantheon. It's got the Eiffel Tower, and that's it. And the amazing thing is, in his book, it's all about how to get around. It's all about when the train gets in. It's all about here's a cheap place to stay. He doesn't tell you practically anything except giving you a few cheap restaurants to go to. Does he even tell you what to do in Paris? Does he? He really doesn't. Look at this. I went through his whole section, it's about 15 pages on Paris, looking for advice about what to do in Paris. And I only came up with 2 things. Here's one of them. Notre Dame. Probably the most famous site in Paris, or tied with the Louvre and the Eiffel Tower or whatever. The Cathedral of Notre Dame. How does it come up in his book? It's because you can take a bath in the municipal bathhouse next to Notre Dame. It doesn't even mention what Notre Dame is. Why? Because people could just go find things themselves and discover things on their own. Let's see. I'm just going to skip over this part. Too much reading. There, finally. Most famous. Okay, I'm going to start, and I think this is going to be it, with one final tale of discovery. It always amazed me how nervous I would get about going off of my plans. I did actually make plans, and I still do when I travel, but my plan is made as a sort of a last resort. If nothing goes, if I find nothing else that I'd rather be doing, it's like a backup. So in this particular case, I was in Turkey. I was in this town, this city called Gaziantep. I was there doing a story about pistachios. It is one of the world's principal pistachio, these are pistachio trees back there, producers. And that means they produce baklava as well in the city. And I ate so much baklava, it's so delicious. And I decided one day, I had a day left, I'm going to go to this other city, which is an hour away, which is famous for its ruins. Okay, so and the city is Sanliurfa, which I'm definitely pronouncing incorrectly. So I took an hour drive from Gaziantep to Sanliurfa. And I'm driving along, and I realize this is I think a view from the actual highway. I am going through all these pistachio fields, and I've just been doing a story about pistachios in the city, just eating baklava, and suddenly I'm in the pistachio fields. Like, I want to go out into the pistachio fields. And so I say, oh my God, what I'm going to do? I'm going to miss these great ruins in Sanliurfa. Oh my God, I can't believe it. And I see a sign off the road, and it has 3 village names, and each village is like 3 or 4 or 5 kilometers off the road. And I say, oh my God, should I go down that road? I'm going to waste my time. And I can't believe in retrospect that I ever thought this. But that's the kind of nervous, when you're in a foreign country, you kind of get nervous about doing anything different. But I happen to know Turkey was a safe country, and it's a country where people are very hospitable. So I said, okay, I'll go. And this is where I ended up. I get out of the car in this one village. I am there for 5 seconds when a guy comes up to me, an older man coming back from a mosque, and he says, well, with his hands, he somehow gets across, come to my house to eat. And I say, yes. That's, I believe evet is the word for yes in Turkish. It is one of the words that I did learn. Maybe that means no, but whichever it was, I say yes. And I end up spending the afternoon with them, and they actually put on a concert for me. This guy is playing a traditional Turkish stringed instrument. They fed me. Actually, they fed me alone before they ate themselves. And you know, it does come up like, is this an ethical thing to do, to go get free food from people when you're traveling? I do question that, and I do try to give people gifts, and I do try to make sure they really want this to happen. But here's where I knew that they were enjoying having me with them. Several of them, you see what's going on here? I was taking pictures of them. They were filming me the whole time. The kids were practicing their English with me. It was really funny actually, because they didn't really speak much English at all, and I didn't speak much Turkish. But this kid knew one phrase that he used very effectively. The phrase was, I love you. And he would use this, for example, in the following sentence. Seth, I love you, Turkey. And that would mean, do you like turkey? And he asked me all sorts of things, pointing and using I love you, and it was actually quite charming. And other thing I found quite interesting is in terms of connections and making connections with our world and what's different and what's the same. In Brazil, where I spent a lot of time, when you leave a place and you've met somebody, you always give the women a kiss on the cheek, or maybe a little hug and a kiss on the cheek, and you always sort of shake the man's hand, and sometimes you give like a little bit of a hug. But here it was exactly the opposite. When I left here, all the boys came up to me and hugged me and kissed me, like on the cheek or whatever, and all the girls held up their hand to shake my hand. And that's just sort of the kind of thing that it's just, you never forget it, and you really begin to think about how the world is, well, first of all, a wonderful place, but also a really diverse place, and the way people think about it is never quite the way it actually is. Let's see. Here's one more very quick story. I was in Naples. I was so sick of going to, it's really famous for pizza, right? Pizza Napolitana. I was really, really sick of going to, okay, I promise this is the last story. I was there, I was writing about pizza, I needed to write a story about pizza for the New York Times. So what was I doing? I was running around to all the most famous pizza places. And it was so disheartening because I was so nervous. I'm going to write a story about pizza in Naples in the New York Times. I'm going to do it for 2 days. There's people who live in Naples who could write this, who are Americans, who've been to every place in Naples. There are chefs who could write this. So I'm like, I'm going to fail. I'm going to be mocked. So I tried to go to all these places, and everywhere I went was full of tourists. I was like, this is just the worst. I have got to get out of this thing. So I did the following. I found the subway map, and I said, I'm going to pick a random subway stop. I'm going to go there. I'm going to go to the first pizza place I see, and that will be the test of whether this is really a great pizza town. So I went to this one. There's Modern Day, completely random. I did ask the people at the place I was staying if it was safe around there, and they said it was. And I went and I walked along, got to I didn't even ask where a pizza place was. I just kind of walked randomly, and I come across this line, and it's a pizza place. So I got in line, I started hanging out, I talked to the people there. I learned something quite fascinating, which is that most people in Naples actually speak the Napolitano dialect, which is completely incomprehensible to Italian. So there's a bunch of students speaking this crazy dialect. I don't speak Italian, but at least I can sort of figure out some stuff. I had no idea what they were saying. They took me in there. You know, I was in this sort of totally raucous place. I saw this couple, and I saw this pizza. I'm like, I'm getting that pizza. I don't know what it is, but I'm getting it. It's called the racchetta pizza because it looks like a racket. This is full of cheese, like it's almost like a Pizza Hut invention. They fill the crust with cheese. And I got this, and it was so delicious. And then I looked on TripAdvisor to see, and this place was on TripAdvisor, it was quite well ranked, but this pizza was not mentioned at all on TripAdvisor. I had truly discovered an amazing pizza that was not even on TripAdvisor by going to a random pizzeria. And so then if you go on TripAdvisor now, though, that's the place. It's number 44. So as you can see, I randomly came across one of the really good restaurants in Naples. But the amazing thing is I didn't know it was really famous, and so it was this fantastic discovery for me. If you go there today, you will find the racchetta pizza mentioned. Let's see. I went for the amazing racchetta as recommended by a New York Times writer. So, anyway, I'm going to skip over this part, but just let's just say that when you spend more money and when you travel, you often isolate yourself from real experiences. And I had this experience at this place called Casa Gambotena in Quito, Ecuador. It's this amazingly gorgeous, it was ranked the best hotel in Latin America at one point by TripAdvisor. But they do everything they can to isolate you from the world of Quito outside. It's right downtown in Quito, right in the middle of all the markets and everything. But what do they do when you come in? First of all, they give you fruits, so you wouldn't have to go to the market and get them. It comes with a little instruction manual of how to eat each of them, which of course I didn't read. So that's a tomate de árbol, a tree tomato. You're not supposed to eat the skin. And I bit right into it. It was so disgusting. And then I read I was supposed to cut it off. And then they leave you this. They leave me a little stuffed animal to your inner child. Do I need this? Why do I need a stuffed animal for my inner child when I should be, oh, forget about it. This is where I should be spending my time. And the hotel is basically giving me all these incentives not to leave the hotel. The reason I have this slide in there is because they have tea time every afternoon in the hotel. So instead of going out, they encourage you to be there by 4, and it's free, to sit around with other tourists and rich Ecuadorians and basically have tea or coffee and like a bunch of British-looking sandwiches and then like one little empanada that represents the Ecuadorian culture. So, in any case, and I'll end with this, like if you really are concerned, you can't get over the fact that you really need to see the famous places, I have the solution for you. Photoshop. This is the birth of Venus. That's not where I am. That's the person that was there originally. So go wander around, then Photoshop yourself in, post it on Instagram. Wow, Florence, beautiful. One guy caught me. But then everyone else, I remember when I had the joy of seeing it. You're looking good. So that's basically it. That's my advice for travel. Sorry for taking so long, but I love talking about this stuff. Happy to take your questions. It did take a long time. I really appreciate everyone's patience with that. Should we just take questions if there are any questions? Who's got a question? Who wants some travel advice? Ask me some. I can't tell you, by the way, where to stay in Vietnam. Like, this is the kind of question I don't answer. Where's the best hotels in Vietnam? I couldn't care less where the best hotels are. What's your question?
Just a comment that in 1988, there was a new mini mall opening in New London, New Hampshire.
Uh-huh.
And you would go in and put your name in a box. Every little place. One was a luggage place, one was a bookstore, and all this. And my daughter, my youngest daughter at the time, she was 10, she won. And it was a trip to London.
Oh.
Show tour. 1 week. You got luggage from the luggage store, you got whatever.
Yeah.
But one of the things was a book. And the book was a walking tour of London.
Oh, great.
It's the most, I wish I could remember the exact everything about it, but you would open up and it would take you onto the tube, the subway. You would leave at Charing Cross, you would take 4 steps, go to the right, go to the left, and you go down and there's a pub. Only Brits, no tourists. I went to so many places. Of course, I saw the basic things you would see in London, but it was the most amazing experience because we weren't amongst our own people.
Right.
We were amongst regular people, and it was just fascinating, the discovery type of thing. We had no clock to punch.
And I want to point something out about that. you don't have to literally wander. Like sometimes I like to do that because it makes for a good story, but you just have to find the right resource, like this travel guide, and make that sort of what guides you
And it was
around.
exciting to wake up the next day, where are we going this time?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
it was just.
And by the way, I mean, I use my cell phone as much as everybody else, except for Eric who doesn't have a smartphone, but that's, right? Sorry to keep bringing you up, but, I like to have a foil during my presentations. I use it as much as everyone else, but I will tell you, when you are traveling, I prefer to use my phone in the hotel and then not use TripAdvisor, Yelp, and Google Maps when I'm out on the road. I mean, there's nothing more ridiculous than trying to find your way somewhere in Paris and going like this. Okay, now I gotta turn left here, I gotta turn. There's literally a verb in French that means to wander around that is often used in Paris, flâner, right? It's a whole verb that's exactly the opposite of this. You're not supposed to look at your phone when you're walking around Paris. It's just too beautiful. There's too much to discover. The last thing you need in Paris is to walk the straightest line between 2 points. You really want to get lost. So there's a real balance about how much information to use and how much to sort of wander on your own. And I like the idea of having just sort of a day laid out for you, but obviously you can wander off in any direction you
As
want.
long as you're in a safe area.
Right. There's a lot of guided, sort of unguided tours online. Any city you go to, you can sort of download a walking tour and just follow that. And I would just say that's great. But if you see something that interests you that's down another block, then go. And if you and I also like to say talk to at least 5 strangers a day when you're traveling. Because maybe 3 of them will ignore you, maybe the 4th one won't speak English, but then the 5th one will tell you where to eat. And to be honest with you, I would rather follow somebody's advice to go to a restaurant than read a bunch of TripAdvisor reviews. Because when I get to the restaurant, if I like it, I'll always associate the restaurant with this person I met randomly on the street. And also they'll say, oh, you gotta get whatever. And then I go and I order whatever. And maybe it's horrible, but it's still a good story. And maybe they'll say, hey, tell Jim I sent you, and he's the owner or whatever. So then you go and you say, hey, I met this guy, and Jim is all friendly or whatever. And really, it doesn't work on TripAdvisor. If they say, tell Jim I sent you on TripAdvisor, you're going to be the 8,000th person to go in and say Jim sent me. Anyway, anything else? Yes?
I totally agree with your philosophy.
Who are you, by the way?
I'm Susan McHugh, and chair of the English department.
Hi.
And I travel a lot,
Yeah.
and I try to stay with friends, I try to eat locally.
Yeah.
Always visit the supermarket whenever you're in another country.
Wow, that's a great piece of advice. There's nothing more interesting than going to the supermarket in another country.
Yeah, but lately I've been really thinking, you mentioned ethics.
Yeah.
There are cities that are being ruined right now by
Yeah.
tourism, and one of the big things that I think a lot about is Airbnb versus hotels.
Yeah.
So, what's your position?
Oh,
on
I
that?
have a position.
Yeah, you're
Um,
right.
Yeah. Well, Airbnb and Uber, and which is also a travel app, even though it's also a non-travel app. All these companies have the same problem, which is their profit motive. Like, these are good ideas that, because they just absolutely need to make as many millions or billions of dollars as possible, so that for their either shareholders, or in Airbnb's case, because they're going to go public at some point and they want it to be worth billions of dollars, that their good idea just grows kind of like a cancer and turns into something completely different. So Airbnb, to me, what's great about Airbnb, I assume how many people have actually used Airbnb to stay somewhere? Okay, well, if you haven't, you probably know what it is. You go on, you see people's houses that you can stay in, and instead of a hotel, you stay in somebody's house. The problem is that at the beginning, I remember my first ever experience on Airbnb. It was in Bermuda. It was the Frugal Traveler, really expensive to stay in Bermuda. I found someone's futon for $52 a night. This was probably 2010. And Airbnb started a couple years before that. And it was perfect because it was just the futon in her living room. She was someone who actually lived in Bermuda. She gave me a bunch of advice. The important thing is I wasn't taking up anyone else's space. No one was going to live on that futon if I wasn't there. And that was it. But now what is Airbnb? It's grown so much that it's become, many people buy apartments just to sell them as Airbnb locations. And that's exactly the opposite of what Airbnb was supposed to be. You were supposed to get in fact, if you look at Airbnb today, it still looks like you're at someone's house and that's the experience. You're staying in a real person's house. But half the time, it's not a real person's house. It's literally someone who's created a hotel, a one-room hotel in a residential area, and thus taken, in New York, in any city or place that has a housing shortage, you've removed one more apartment or room from the housing market. So my belief is, if I were a better person, I would completely not ever use Airbnb, just like I would completely not ever use Uber, but I'm not really that great of a person. So my mediocre, what I do is I tell people to boycott Airbnb by using Airbnb the way it was meant to be. So I will use Airbnb and rent someone, as long as I'm sure that the place I'm staying is a real person's home that they really live in, then I'll use it. By the way, it's not always easy to tell. They're all on there trying to trick you into thinking it's their, I mean, sometimes it's just ridiculous. The description of the person says, "Hi, I'm Ronald. You're really going to love my home. I love Lisbon. It's incredible. This home is, has all the comforts for you. And if you need any advice, I'll be available. Welcome to my home." And then you click on other properties from Roberto, and he's got like 15 homes that he says the same thing about. In a lot of places, this is becoming illegal. There's if I'm not mistaken, Washington, D.C., I think is going to pass a really good Airbnb law, which prohibits anyone from renting their place out for more than 60 days a year. So that essentially stops you from doing anything but using it for when you're away. So, anything else? A couple minutes left? Yeah. Who are you?
My name is Joe.
Hi.
I'm here with Professor Lila. To the opposite point of that,
Yeah.
I feel like understanding different cultures could help you understand tourists. I'm from Nassau County, and I work in the 5 boroughs a lot.
Oh, yeah, okay.
And it's annoying to see a whole German family standing in the middle of just a crowded street at like 12:30, trying to get to lunch. But then learning about how they kind of have a tourism history and they're supposed to go out and see the beauty of things. Maybe I won't go through the family anymore. I'll go around.
Yeah, that is I've noticed that, of course, everyone who's in Manhattan or like Times Square, I just avoid. You just can't go through there because you're just never going to get through because there's going to be a German family. It doesn't have to, it could be any family from anywhere. And it just drives you crazy, and so you want to just be like, "Excuse me," but now I also try to give them a break. The other thing I've noticed is I live in Queens, outside of Manhattan. It's a neighborhood, I mentioned it's got a ton of restaurants. Once in a while, tourists will come there. And I notice this amazing thing. When I see tourists in Manhattan, I want to kill them. Like, get out of here, you're ruining the city, you're holding me up. When I see the tourists in Queens in my own neighborhood, which is only a 20-minute subway ride, I go right up to them and I'm like, "What are you doing here? What do you want to see? Can I give you some advice?"
And kind of the growth of Jackson Heights, because my parents lived there for a while.
Oh, yeah?
And it's a totally different place now. You definitely see more tourists than you would have seen.
Well, you know what it is in part? I mean, it's a little bit gentrified, but what the tourists come for is the immigrant-run restaurants. We have Tibetan, Nepalese, Indian, Colombian, Peruvian. What, are your parents from another country?
My dad's Italian, my mom's Ecuadorian.
Ecuador, so a ton of Ecuadorian restaurants. And so it's become a little foodie destination. The other thing is the whole foodie thing didn't exist, 20 or 30 years ago. So no, the idea of like going to a weird neighborhood to eat food was so strange. And now it's so normal. Like, yeah, definitely let's go to the weird neighborhood and eat at the Tibetan restaurant. Yeah, so, well, by the way, and so that brings up, in fact, I always recommend people try to go to places that don't have much tourism, even if it's a neighborhood within the city where there are a lot of tourists, because then you'll get what happened to these tourists with me in Jackson Heights. People will, if someone says to me, if I'm in a weird place and someone says to me, "You're American? What are you doing here?" That's the place for me. Because if people are interested in me, that means I'll get a good experience out of it. And hopefully we can actually interact with each other instead of just, hoping they spend more money to boost the economy. I think we're out of time. Is there any last quick question?
Plenty of time to ask questions tonight at 5.
Right, there's a panel, which I will You will not have to listen to me talk the whole time. There will be many people talking. I do encourage you, in the meantime, to buy the book. You do not have to, but if you do buy the book and bring it to the panel tonight, I would be happy to sign it for you. I'm very available online. I mean, I don't really give like specific travel advice, but if you have any comments and you didn't want to say it out loud, at Seth Kugel is everything. If you go to my website, sethkugel.com, you can send me an email from there. And I really appreciate it. You guys are a great audience. Thanks.